Hello. Welcome to our study of Solomon. I'm Steve Turner. I teach a Sunday school class here at First United Methodist Church in Starkville. And over the course of the last several months, our class has been studying Solomon and his wisdom, his wealth, and his women. If you remember in our last series of lessons, we talked about his wealth and his wisdom. And now today we're going to talk about his women. And again, all of this is predicated on his wisdom and wealth. And so what we see here is we're in 1 Kings. We're in chapter 10. Verse 23, it says, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kue. The royal merchants purchased them from Kue at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Armenians. Chapter 11, we start to see the wives and the women that Solomon was associated with, and really this is going to be an important event in his life, and it happened over years. It wasn't one year. You've got to remember he reigned for 40 years. The first 20 were we think he was in his teenage years when he inherited the throne from his father David. So he would have been around 30 to 40 sometime at the midpoint of his reign. A lot of those first years were putting administration in place, building. There was a lot of building. He built a temple. Took him 7 years to build a temple. He built palaces. Took him a while to build those, 13 years to build a palace. And now he's got a lot of wealth. He's been trading. He's got a lot of alliances. And so we're now in 1 Kings chapter 11, if you want to follow along. By the way, we're using the New International Version of the Bible. Chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughters, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth, and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of your father David, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Stop there. Okay. So we're at the point now where Solomon has accumulated a vast amount of wealth. And with that, and with the alliances that he made with all the different nations and all the different peoples, he also married to cement the alliances. And it says he had, let's see here, it says he had 700 wives of royal birth. Now that's just the wives he had that were royalty. He's also got 300 concubines. If my math is correct, that's 1,000. So he has 1,000 wives and concubines that he has to support. That is quite a investment. So not only is he, and it says, many of these women he loved. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Now we know he married Pharaoh's wife. That's been talked about. He did that fairly early and cemented that relationship with Egypt. But now we see him marrying just Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. And when you look at the history of Israel, these were not friendly nations to Israel, but because of Solomon's prowess and because of his wealth and his trade, he created alliances with these nations and these people. And again, he cemented these relationships through intermarriage, which was not unusual at all. But if you remember, God granted him wisdom and discernment so that he could use it for the benefit of his people. And he had 1,000 women, which first of all, it's hard to imagine having a relationship with 1,000 women. And so there's not enough time in the day or year or 40 years of his reign to have any kind of real relationship with 1,000 women. But he also acknowledged their gods, and he built, it says here, he built high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And these were just two examples. He built these high places for lots of these different wives and their gods. And you got to remember, he didn't totally forsake God. Yahweh, the true God. What he did was his allegiance was dissipated. So it kind of was leaking out. It was oozing out. His love for God was being dissipated. And really, that's a major lesson for us, because I think that's the danger we have, especially as we get more comfortable in our lives with wealth and with other kinds of things. And God responds to this. Now, it's interesting in God's response to what is happening with Solomon. Remember, when Solomon was born, the first lesson we talked about David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba is Solomon's mother. And when Solomon was born, it says that God loved him. So God has loved Solomon from the very day he was born. And God never forsakes Solomon. He's disappointed in him. and there are going to be major consequences to his behavior, but he still loves him and basically takes care of him. And as you saw in verse 9, chapter 11, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of your hand of your son. Yet I will tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." He really has an affinity for David, Solomon's father. David had a heart for the Lord. He made lots of mistakes, but he was a giant among the Jewish people. With his heart was a heart after God. Solomon was a descendant, and in many ways the same way. But again, he built up a nation, and partly he became a king rather than the person Solomon. So he took on the role as king, and with that role, he gained a lot of power. And with that power, there became responsibilities, and that became more important to him in many ways than his relationship to God. We see later that how this is going to happen. So there were adversaries. Solomon had internal and external adversaries. And basically his son, who inherited, supposedly would have inherited the throne, he's not going to do that. The kingdom is going to get split again. It's going to split into the northern and southern kingdom. And the tribe, the one tribe that Solomon's son is going to rule is going to be in the southern kingdom. So again, we see that in Jeroboam is one of his adversaries, one of the more famous ones. So in verse 26 of chapter 11, it says there are several adversaries, but one of the biggest one is Jeroboam. So in verse 26 it said, "Also Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's official, an Ephraimite from Zarephath, and his mother was a widow named Zerah." Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. This is an internal rebellion. Solomon had built terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall in the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out to Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I've chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor have done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes, by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt. So Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. So we see an internal adversary arise who was very skillful. And Solomon recognized Jeroboam's skill because he put him in charge of his personnel, forced labor. And really, Jeroboam was told, this is what's going to happen. I'm disappointed in Solomon. He's not done he's not following my decrees. He's built high places for these other gods, which are detestable. And so you're going to get the majority of the kingdom. You're going to be the king, and your power is going to be vast. But again, there's a condition here. This will all occur, and this will continue to occur. You'll continue to reap these benefits and responsibilities if you follow my decrees and my commands. Well, as you probably know, that's pretty hard to do over a long period of time, and he doesn't accomplish that very well. Solomon immediately recognizes the threat of Jeroboam, which is probably his biggest threat, and he tries to kill him, but he goes to Egypt and takes sanctuary in Egypt. And he waits until Solomon dies. And this brings us to the end of Solomon's life. So in verse 41, chapter 11 of 1 Kings, we read, "As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king." So we see the death of Solomon. He reigned for 40 years, much like his father David. And his son Rehoboam is going to inherit the throne, but we already know that that's not going to last. Now, our story really is going to end here. Our lesson on Solomon is going to end with his death. But you need to understand there have been consequences beyond his life that are going to affect not only the kingdom of Israel, but the lineage of David and Solomon. And so, what are some lessons that we can learn as we've explored the life of Solomon? Because we want to do this because we're going to move next into some of his wise sayings. And we saw early in some of our lessons that he was endowed with skill. He was very skillful with words. He was very skillful with music. He wrote poems. He wrote songs. He wrote Proverbs, and that will be our next series of lessons will be on Proverbs. And he was very wise in the sense of what we know in this world. He was able to make some really discerning decisions. He was admired throughout the world for those decisions. But again, he had some weaknesses, and he made some mistakes. The major mistake he made was forgetting that all he had and that all he was a gift from God. And I think the telling of Solomon's story is important for us. Solomon inherited his kingdom at a very young age. He was, we think, around 15 or somewhere in his teens. Before that, he was a student. So we know that his knowledge and his wisdom didn't just occur overnight when God said, yes, I'm going to give you this gift. He had been preparing for the gift that God continued to endow him with and give him extra measure of this wisdom. So we saw that as a young man, we hypothesized that he was studying, he was in the royal court, he had access to the best education available, and he took advantage of that. He also had a mother that was in his corner, so to speak. He also had Nathan the prophet, who was also in his corner, and that's really how he became king. If you remember, his older brother had seized the throne, and David had to step in and say, no, 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 Solomon will be my successor on the throne here. So we see that very early in his life, he took advantage of the situation that he was put in. He became king. He asked for wisdom above all else. God gave him that. And God gave him wisdom that has never been approached before Solomon nor after Solomon. If we believe what we're told in 1 Kings, no person ever has had as much wisdom as Solomon. This is really important. Jesus studied Proverbs. That's my hypothesis. Jesus knew about Solomon. He knew the wisdom of Solomon. He knew the writings of Solomon. And he often would not repeat verbatim, but you can see Solomon's wisdom in a lot of what Jesus is doing and what Jesus' teachings are. Most important, in my mind, teaching in the Bible is Matthew 6 and 7, 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. If you really want to know Jesus, go to that part of Scripture and read his teachings. You'll learn that he is an amazing perspective. He has an amazing perspective on life, on God, and our relationship to fellow men. Back to Solomon. The lesson that we need to learn from Solomon. And many of us in the United States, we're pretty comfortable. So this morning, you probably got up, depending on your work situation, you might have gone to work. If you're retired, you had your cup of coffee, read your newspaper. If you get a physical newspaper, there's a habit you have. There's something you do most mornings. All of that is dependent on you having a shelter, something over your head. It's dependent on you having access to probably electricity. Could be dependent on you having food available, transportation. All these things are a gift from God. And here in the United States, we have an abundance, in most cases, of these things. This puts us in the situation of Solomon. Solomon was king, but he didn't have the things that we have today. And so the lesson that we need to take from Solomon is that don't get complacent. Don't get fat and happy. Now, Solomon always had projects ahead of him until later. And he became less of a builder. He became less of a, he kind of said, okay, so he accumulated. What did he really accumulate? Well, he accumulated assets, but we learn at the end of his life that one of the things he accumulated were alliances through marriages. And most of us don't do that here in the United States. We're married to one person usually, if we're married at all. But again, this drew him away from God and drew him into situations that he didn't leave God totally. It just kind of drained out. And God doesn't like that. God likes our total devotion. It's hard, but that's what God wants. In many ways, it's easy though. And Jesus teaches us there are mainly two main two main commandments that we need to follow. Love God and love your fellow man. Now, we're lucky in that we have the New Testament. Back here in 1 Kings, Solomon didn't have that, but God gave him that measure of wisdom to know that. Thank you for spending this time with us. Next week, or next time we meet, we will start in the book of Proverbs. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and do that, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.